Chapter 1. Back in the Day. One of my earliest memories of childhood was hearing my father say, "Hey, pissy eyes, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about." I was always crying in my early years, mainly because I wanted to divert attention from what was usually my parents yelling at each other and my low tolerance for being a pussy. There was a constant turmoil and arguing in my household. My father, Joey, liked to drink, and he drank a lot. I was in a constant state of anxiety as a kid, which carried over to later in my life as I ended up having horrific anxiety attacks in my teens and early 20s. I literally never felt safe with my parents. I was always thinking, oh, is this the moment we're all going to die? And what's it going to be? Off a cliff? A car accident? A fire? I was constantly in a state of fear, petrified that I can perish at any moment. Dad would drive drunk, and it was terrifying. Red lights to me were my solace, and a moment to go, I'm still alive. Then the light would turn green again, and I'd be right back to the terror of, holy shit, am I gonna make it? When you speak about drinking and driving, it's normally about someone drinking and then driving. My dad would do the two simultaneously. He would drive with the beer between his legs and constantly be fiddling with the radio. He had a CB radio, and he'd be turning the wheel so the cord would get wrapped around the steering column as he would be trying to light one of his Trarton cigarettes. He may as well have been juggling knives and driving the car with his knees. I was horrified. That said, he never spilled a fucking drop, and thankfully never crashed with me in the car. He drove a Rambler, which was essentially a death trap on wheels. I'd be in the passenger seat with no seatbelt. If there was a seatbelt, it was shoved down so deep in the seat along with the dry, fossilized McDonald's French fries and coins from the Confederacy that I never would have found it. The dashboard was steel. There was no padding on it, and there certainly weren't airbags. I would be dead if he'd hit a briar patch. My father worked so hard at not working. That was the big issue between my parents. The fights were always about finances and my father's lack of income, and maybe a little cheating on the side. The first job I remember my dad having was collecting the change from vending machines. I remember this period because there were nights I'd have Zagnut and Snickers bars for dinner. He'd also get gas and would just start pouring out quarters into the gas station attendant's hands. He was obviously pilfering from the machines he was collecting from. A vending machine once fell on his leg, and then he was out on workers' comp. To this day, I think he purposely did it. Dad had us moving all over the place when I was a kid. We were constantly packing up and moving from one location to the next, like a traveling horde of gypsies. If the Cumia family lived somewhere for 2 straight years, that was really something. I was born in Flushing, Queens, New York, which I'd have zero recollection of if not for some home movies. The first place I remember living was Long Island. The address was 8 Elwyn Place. All the street names started with L. There were Elwood, Elmont, and Elford. And I lived in Elford, my kindergarten year. My dad tried to buy that house and he had a mortgage. I guess that didn't pan out because we even eventually ended up in East Islip. At this point in my life, I craved the spotlight, which applies to everything in my life, right up to and including this very moment. My entire job is based on me saying, "Look at me, listen to me." I don't remember a time in my life when I was not making people laugh and thinking it was the greatest fucking thing ever. I would constantly be dragged by my parents to adult events, like a wedding, a christening, or whatever it was that Italian families did all together back then. There seemed to be 1,000 people at these things, and afterward there were parties with food, drinking, and adults talking loudly. Even back then it was always, "Look at me!" I would start doing impressions at that time. I was watching movies on TV that had been made 40 years before I was born with people like Mae West, W.C. Fields, and the Three Stooges. Oh, the Three Stooges and the Marx Brothers. I would do impressions of these people for adults and they would laugh their asses off. This would be like seeing a 6-year-old today doing impressions from The Godfather. If I saw a kid doing Don Corleone or other Godfather impressions, I'd lose my shit. I'm not sure my impressions were all that good, but just the context of them had to be outrageous. People loved it, and I loved making them laugh while being the center of attention. Making my friends or cousins laugh always came easily to me, but to make the grown-ups laugh was something else. It was more significant and more special. This was something my friends couldn't do. This ability I had became a defense mechanism. I could usually diffuse any situation with a couple of jokes. I realized my acid of humor could help me socially with friends and, most important, with the girls. Laughter was a payment for me to get something like, I made you laugh, now I want something in return. But sometimes my sense of humor got me into trouble I couldn't get out of. Chapter 2. Boomer. I was living in East Islip, Long Island, attending Timber Point Elementary School. Norman Boomer Esiason, who went on to become the NFL MVP in 1998 as the quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals and is currently a broadcaster for television and radio, attended school with me in the 5th grade. Boomer was the gym teacher's pet, the very definition of jock, and I was the complete opposite. I had zero interest in sports and couldn't have cared less if I did well in gym class. Boomer was also the classic school bully. He could have been perfectly cast for any after-school TV special. He would walk around the cafeteria and fart in people's faces. Literally, walk up to someone, grab their head, lift his leg, and fart in their face. I knew his given name was Norman Esiason. Everyone knew this, but no one ever called him Norman. If you called him Norman, he would beat the shit out of you. Not even the teachers would call him Norman. He was Boomer. One day I thought it would be funny, and I'd get a little jab in if I yelled Norman at him as I looked around the corner of the hallway without him seeing me. I saw him coming and yelled, Norman! My friends and I had planned to run off, but right as I turned around, one of Boomer's friends was standing in the hallway, and I knew I was busted. He looked at me smiling and just nodded. Later that day, Boomer came up and gave me the obligatory, I'm going to kick your ass after school. I was a string bean. I looked like a bulimic meth head compared to Boomer, who was a jacked Nordic Viking in 5th grade. The end of the day rolled around. It was springtime, but still cold outside. I had one of those big snorkel jackets like Kenny on South Park wears, with a big tunnel hood. I decided I'd keep it on. Everyone usually rips their coats off and takes off their shirt when they fight. They're like, come on, let's do this. I figured the more I had on, the less it would hurt. I didn't care about moving quickly because I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I'd never been in a fight, and of course my first bout had to be with the Norwegian Prince of East Islip. We squared off in the school's back field. There was a big turnout. It's bad enough knowing you'll be getting your ass kicked, but hey, let's make it a school assembly for good measure. I started circling around because that's all I knew from the movies. I was moving my fists in this weird backward and forward rotation like a punch-drunk 1920s boxer. Meanwhile, Boomer looked like a seasoned, undefeated heavyweight champ in his prime. I knew this was a real fight, and I had to throw a punch. I lunged forward and threw an overhand right, hitting him squarely in the forehead. If you've ever seen Boomer Esiason's forehead, you know it's a billboard. It was always like that, even in the 5th grade. I felt my arm just tingle and go numb after the first blow, and I was paralyzed. I got the first shot in with the hardest punch I could with my little straw arms. Imagine hitting one of those huge African water buffaloes in the head. He felt nothing. Didn't even flinch. Boomer then grabbed me by the coat, punching me once in the side of the head and once in the stomach. I was on the ground, and it was over. Boomer had put on a clinic like Tyson in a one-round fight. He walked away like this was just another day at the office. Ladies, come hither. I went home dejected and defeated, crying to my mum, Ro, that I had gotten beat up. I told her, my arm doesn't feel right. She got the heating pad, which was the cure-all for everything. Anthony, let me get the heating pad. Mom, it's leukemia. The next morning, my arm was like an overstuffed sausage. It was swollen, and I couldn't move my hand at all. My mom loaded me in the car and took me to Dr. Fuchs, who was this female German pediatrician straight out of Nazi Germany. She had the strongest accent, never cracked a smile, and sported a Hitler mustache. All kidding aside, she was always serious. Your arm is broken. You broke the radius and ulna bones in your forearm. I couldn't believe it. I had broken my arm punching this jerk-off's gargantuan head. I had a cast put on for 8 weeks. It was embarrassing going back to school the next day. Hey everyone, in case you didn't hear, I got my ass kicked. Here's proof of it, and a constant reminder. You could see Boomer was very proud. He had the audacity to sign my cast. Well, what was I going to do? Tell him no so he could break the other fucking arm? I'd have been walking around with 2 casts. I should have asked him to sign it Norman. Chapter 3. This is going to hurt. In my early days, one aspect in which I resembled my father was never being able to finish something that I had started. I saw a marionette on TV one afternoon and decided I was going to make one. I got some paper towels and tape and figured I'd try and make something out of them. I made a face with magic markers but failed to apply the most important part of the marionette, the strings and wooden pieces. At this point, I was carrying this marionette around. My dad keenly observed this and quickly came to the conclusion that a marionette without strings was a fucking doll. He barked, "No son of mine is going to be carrying a fucking doll around with him." I, of course, started crying, and my dad said, "Hey, pissy eyes, don't be a faggot. I'm not taking you anywhere in public with you carrying that doll." Mom sprang to my defense. "No, Joey, it's not a doll. It's a puppet." My dad retorted, "Until the puppet has strings, it's a fucking doll." My parents then started arguing about what qualified as a puppet, a marionette, and or a doll. Mom was very sympathetic to me. She was always sticking up for me whenever my dad was on the brink of a meltdown, which felt like always. I remember Dad relaxing. As a kid, I was in a constant fight or flight state. Imagine, as a kid, constantly living on that edge. You want a knuckle sandwich, Anthony? Fight or flight. Every day, 24 hours a day. I guess it's what molded me into the upstanding human I am today. My family had one reprieve a week, and that was when my parents would watch Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In on the tube. Then I could exhale and decompress because I knew for 1 hour my folks would be consumed with this show. My brother Joe and I could hear our parents laughing together. The show was on past our bedtime, but Joe and I would try and sneak a peek to see what was so funny. We didn't get the jokes, but were fascinated by what was making our parents crack up. My dad would catch us and warn us to get back into our room or else. He would then hang his belt on the handle of our bedroom door as a final warning. We'd see that belt glimmering in the light, and we wanted no part of it. The way my father handled things was like DEFCON levels 1 through 5. A normal level was a verbal threat to "knock it off in there," my dad would say. "Stop busting my chops." I never understood that at first. I took it literally. I didn't know what chops meant. One day I asked to borrow his power tools, and he said no. I kept begging him, and he finally said, "Don't bust my chops." I was like, okay. I thought he was giving me permission to use the power tools, but telling me to just not damage the chops. I thought chops was his favorite tool. The next DEFCON level for him was displaying his belt. This was what we were going to get if we didn't listen. My dad was a virtuoso with a belt. He knew how to use it and swing it. He would fold it in half so it was doubled. He went with the straight down overhead technique, going right down the middle. He had a nice Reggie Jackson swing. It was terrifying, and getting hit with the belt was the worst possible thing to happen to me as a kid. Whenever I got into trouble, I knew my dad was going to be dishing out the belt punishment. The hours I spent waiting for him to come home were punishment enough. I would freak out just at the prospect of getting hit. My dad would essentially give me a spanking with the belt on the meaty part of my ass. He would talk as he hit me with every syllable. don't ever do that again. Or I was like, no multisyllable words, please. You're killing me, Pop. I don't find this humorous at all. The inconsistencies in your story don't add up. Dad, Jesus, call me an asshole, hit me, and let's call it a day. My parents ended up separating when I was in 5th grade. At first, they tried to keep it from us by saying my father was busy working. And I would see him once a week, mostly on the weekends. It actually made things a little better, because he seemed to be less angry and able to have more fun with us. There were the pre-pickup and post-drop-off times when my parents exchanged smirks and little verbal shots back and forth, and that was a little weird. That said, all the arguments finally stopped because he wasn't living there anymore, which was definitely a good thing. I did hate the fact that my parents were divorced, though. When I was a child, my mindset was that I'd rather have the constant arguing than have to say my parents were separated. In hindsight, it was obviously a much better situation. Since my father wasn't around full time, my mom had to take over the role of disciplinarian, which didn't come easily to her. I think she wanted to show us that we couldn't do whatever we wanted. One time I got busted for lying about taking part something just to see how it worked. I would disassemble something without even ever being able to put it back together. I was only 10 years old. I wasn't a fucking engineer. My mom saw the broken toaster oven in pieces and started the interrogation. She quickly surmised I was lying and was clearly the guilty party. My mother, now forced into the position of enforcer for the first time, took out the belt my father had used so effectively, but she didn't know how to use it. She grabbed it by the buckle, but didn't fold it all the way dear old Dad had perfected. So if you can imagine this, Mom whipped the belt around like Indiana Jones and used an odd sidearm technique the way Randy Johnson would throw a fastball. I didn't know how to defend against it. My go-to defense was running into my bedroom and jumping in the lower bunk bed as far as I can go. This worked well with my dad's overhead delivery because it was hard to get in between the top and lower bunks. It took some steam off his trajectory. Mum's first swat with the belt snapped out with the pointy part that was tapered and hit me directly on the head of my dick. I let out a scream so loud it was comparable only to the screams of that little Vietnamese girl running down the street after she was napalmed. That's how loud and brutal my scream was. My mom instantly dropped the belt and started crying, asking me, "What's the matter?" She had never heard me cry like that before and knew I was really hurt. I said, "You hit my wee-wee." I now had to ice this deformed, inflamed, mushroom-like head of my cock. I had a Ron Jeremy head with a child's shaft. Jesus. It looked like a doorknob. My mother never mentioned it and retired from ever disciplining me again. To be fair, my mother made me feel safer than my father had. She always tried her best by pampering and caring for me. She was very sympathetic to my pissy eyes. I was a needy, attention whore kid. My mother would consistently go on school field trips with me. Anytime our elementary school went to the planetarium or the museum, I asked if she'd be the field trip mom, and she always said yes. I would actually make wardrobe requests of her like, "Mom, I need you to wear this red mini skirt and put it in the pigtails." I made her dress up because my friends would always tell me, "Your mom is so pretty." I'd be like pimping my mom out for those field trips. I want the go-go boots and the skirt that Dad says your ass looks good in. All the kids loved my mom. She was the fun, nice mom. All my other friends' moms seemed old, and my mom was young, fun, and vibrant. One field trip we went to Radio City Music Hall to see a boy named Charlie Brown. My mom was super hungover, throwing up that morning, and in pretty bad shape. But she promised she'd be the field trip mom. I remember her in the back of the bus chugging from a bottle of Pepto-Bismol. She was talking to all my friends with a pink tongue. The other field trip moms were looking at her like she was a degenerate. "Hey, fuck them," she went, and it was a lot of fun. During this period of separation, my father was dating different girls. Women gravitated to him, and he had a plethora of 20-something bimbos. I'd be visiting my dad for the weekend, and he'd take us to bars or his apartment. Whomever he was dating that week would cook and make a pathetic attempt to be my mom. My dad had no self-control with women. He was never like, maybe I shouldn't. This girl isn't all there. She's married and has a record. Perfect. It didn't fucking matter. If he found them attractive, it was going to happen. My father was a lot like me, completely fixated on women. He tried to figure out how he could see every single one of them who showed any interest. My siblings, sounds like me. My siblings and I went over to my dad's apartment one day, and he had this one girl cook us dinner. We just met her that once, and she wrote these little notes that she gave my dad to give to each of us. They were weird complimentary assessments of all the kids. She mentioned Joe's talent for being a musician. My sister Dawn was so young that it was more or less about being a princess. Mine was that I was so funny and she could see me being a comedian or entertainment personality. Leave it to my dad to bang a clairvoyant. She was the Nostradamus of Mineola, and her mac and cheese wasn't too shabby either. In all honesty, I don't know why it took my parents so long to tell us they were divorcing, but within a year my father moved to California for a fresh start, living initially with his aunt in Laguna Beach, and then in Dana Point. My father ended up moving to a predominantly equestrian western-style town called San Juan Capistrano in Orange County, California, which is where the Swallows end up every year. He really made a complete transformation, buying horses, getting a cowboy hat with the boots, and drinking at the local western bars. Even though my father had distanced himself from us geographically, he still stayed in touch with phone calls every week and an open invitation to visit him whenever we wanted. My mother really stepped up raising us by herself. She could have easily denied us a lot of things and been bitter. She could have put herself first and us kids on the back burner. But Mom was very involved, kept us well fed, and made sure we had a great childhood. She usually worked 3 jobs at once so she could make sure that my brother, sister, and I were well provided for. We never had to worry about anything, and she gave us the stability we needed.